GMOs, genetically modified organisms, always a controversial topic and always a topic in genetics to be talked about. And technically, a genetically modified organism is any organism that we have actively worked to change the genes in it. So, in reality, we've been doing this for 10,000 years. We've been selectively breeding plants and animals to make them show different traits at different levels to make them better for our food products. So the original potato and apple and tomatoes, for example, were hardly edible. And we have, through selective breeding, we have changed which genes get expressed and which genes get hidden by capitalizing on understanding that the difference between dominant and recessive and crossing plants that show the trait we want and with other plants that show the trait we want, and we keep accentuating those, and we can pretty quickly, in not too many generations, change the genes that are being expressed. Now, the difference is those are still all the genes that are contained within that population of that species. What is happening now, since in the last 30 to 40 years, is using genetic technology to do more genetic engineering and genetic modification, and allows us to go much further and to work much faster. And we first started doing this with bacteria, because bacteria are really simple, and they have a pretty simple genome, and they have this thing called a plasmid. And how bacteria reproduce, they don't have sexual reproduction, but they come together and they exchange pieces of their DNA. So it's part of their cell structure to take in DNA and build it into their DNA. So we figured this out, and we inject DNA into them, and they just take it right into their system, and they use it. And so we can actually use bacteria to grow genes that we want. We can put in a gene we want and use the bacteria like a little biofactory to make the proteins that we want. And then we can harvest those proteins and use those and put those in medicines and things like that. And this all works because the genes in all life are basically the same. A's, T's, G's, and C's. The DNA is basically the same, and it's interchangeable. And it's not bad or good, it's just the same. The DNA structure of a bird is the same as the DNA structure at its basic components as any other organism on the planet. So it is interchangeable in that sense. So that brings us to this idea of transgenic, and that is really what, when we think about genetically modified organisms in like our food crops and products and things like that, that's what people are often talking about. And this is where we are taking the gene from one organism and putting it into another organism. And early methods of doing this was actually using what's called a gene gun. And it was taking little tungsten balls and taking little pieces of genes that were cut out of other organisms and using either chemicals or bacteria to cut these out. And then we would stick them on the little balls, and then we would put it in this gene gun, which would just use air pressure to shoot those little balls through like the leaf of a plant. And some of those genes would get stuck in the nucleus of the cell, and the ball would pass through. They were so small. And then you would take that plant and you could make a cutting from it and grow more of that plant. And as the cells did mitosis, it now had this mutation in it. That was a forced mutation of something we wanted. And that was the first attempts. And we have now been able to do the same thing with other plants and with animals, though we don't use a gene gun with the animals. We use other more precise mechanisms to harvest the genes out that we want and then literally insert them, like a surgical procedure, if you will, into the egg of the cell of the organism before it starts dividing. And then as it divides through mitosis, then all the cells that come from that have that new gene in there. And so we've been able to add genes that make plants resistant to pests. That a gene will, or a plant will produce its own toxin to like a corn borer, BT corn. We can put in a gene from a bacteria that produces a protein that is toxic to the pests that eat the corn. And so now we don't have to put pesticide on the corn. The downside is that other things that eat that corn might be damaged by that toxin as well, like the monarch butterfly that doesn't eat the corn but eats the the milkweed that grows in the same field, and if some of that pollen gets from one to the other and they ingest it, there's concern that they might get sick from that as well. So there's environmental concerns. The big concern that we often hear about in the news, and we talk about whether we should label food with the GMO tag or not, has to do with food safety. And there's been a fair amount of research, though there could always be more. But what we have learned is that we don't really have any evidence that eating genetically modified organisms is unsafe, unless it produces a protein, say like the protein that's in peanuts that makes people allergic to peanuts. Then that could be unsafe. But if it's producing a protein that you might otherwise eat, then whether you eat it in the organism it evolved in or you eat that protein now produced in something else, then if you can eat it in one place, you can eat it in the other place. And so as we've been using these more and more, and we've been using them quite a bit, and we probably don't even know how much we're ingesting these, there isn't a lot of research that would say that this is dangerous. It still makes a lot of people nervous because if it's causing problems, maybe we don't even know it's causing problems. And so there's a lot more research to be done there. So this is a very controversial side of genetically modified organisms, whether they should label the foods. Some would argue that yes, we should know what we're eating, and others would argue that because of fear tactics, then nobody would eat those products even though they're perfectly safe. Answer to be discovered later. We still don't know. I do want to talk about this from a different point of view that isn't often talked about, but to think of it from more of a holistic or ecological point of view. We know that with an ecosystem, when we put a species in that shouldn't be there, it could become invasive. So we have Asian beetles in North America that have become invasive. They spread all over the place. We have buckthorn as a tree that takes over whole forests. And those are species that were brought in either purposefully or on accident. Fire ants in southeast United States as well. They were brought in, and then because they didn't have a role in the ecosystem, they could just take over. They had no predators. And so they could take over, and it changed the whole ecosystem. What if we thought of the genome as like an ecosystem? We know that the genes are all connected, and one gene might turn on another gene and turn on another gene and turn on another gene. And just like in an ecosystem, if we change a species in there, it might have no effect, or it might have a big effect and might become a keystone species. The one thing that hasn't been answered is this question of, well, what if we put a gene in and that becomes like a keystone gene? And that turns on other genes, which then radically changes that organism. And if that organism is radically changed, maybe that will change its role in a food chain, and then in a food web, and so on. And maybe it becomes a keystone species or stops being a keystone species in an ecosystem. So there's lots to be thought about and researched regarding genetic engineering. The one thing that is for sure is we have this technology to change genes at the level of specific genes in specific organisms in specific cells. That technology isn't going away. So now the question is, what can we do safely? What is ethical to do? And who will make those decisions?